2021, including opposition to reform. I'm Tausif, chairing around. My preference today. Nika, you please.
I'm from Shanghai News and
Yeah.
If you guys will introduce yourself as well.
my name is Cheryl, preferred pronounce you.
Similarly. Okay. Oh, I do keep.
Sure, me no preferred gender pronoun.
Sharik. We are here. Next.
Right, so the further ado, the House invites the Prime Minister to open the debate.
Yeah.
Oh, Sinha's not doing PM.
Oh, my.
All right. We believe it's sad that an activity that's supposed to bring joy to communities and provide entertainment for all has become anything less than accessible, or rather that's often exploitative and something that's very driven up to the point that it disregards what it's supposed to be for in the first place. In this motion, we're not only talking about all the big teams, right, that opposition would probably want to talk about. We're also probably talking, and if not mostly talking about the small teams that are meaning and joy to community, that provide avenues for gatherings, etc. We believe that we require all sports teams, majority owned members of the local community. What will it look like? We think it just means that most of the share of these local teams will be owned by municipalities, and in turn, like this will include the members of the city itself. To some degree, we still allow private owners to have it, right? So we think we won't have any problem with money because these private donors will still inject money and be willing to inject money because there's still a degree of profit to be given by that. And what we mean by this is that it will allow the majority to have more decision-making power in the board, for example. So I'm going to talk about several problems that exist in the status quo and how we're going to fix it in government. First, the problem of outsourcing. Second is the problem of affordability. And third is the problem of accountability and in general how it provides meaning to the people who are supposed to own these sports, who are supposed to derive meaning from the sports. So without further ado, on to the first problem. In the status quo, we see that local teams, for example, Barcelona, for example, teams of cities in the Premier League, owning players, and it's not only about the big teams, right? Even local teams in Indonesia own foreign players or players who are very famous because it's so much easier to just depend on a name or like a popularity of a player to attract to your own teams because you are very money driven and you are profit driven and you want odds for your teams. And because that's your main goal, in turn, most of your players are not from your local communities. If we're talking about towns in general, like we're talking, no thank you, about cities in general, probably you're going to have to invest more in attracting local recruits as opposed to having people who are already there. So we see that as a problem because that means there's a barrier to entry for people who actually live in these towns who are owning the name of the town and the local sports teams. We changed that incentive with this policy. How? We think that at the moment when you have municipalities owning or local communities owning these teams, no thank you, you'll be more invested in actually providing training, for example, or recruiting local kids, local soccer players, for example, in the case of soccer. I'll take you in a second. Why? Because your priority is no longer exclusively about profit, but actually about the community in the same way that municipalities care about the communities or the taxpayers that you're supposed to be accountable for. We think you have more incentive to hire local communities. And we think this is meaningful for kids, for example, from rural or poorer communities that are often not able to even start out or like develop their talents in the first place. Before I move on to the second problem.
If you say buying foreign players is highly lucrative to the health of the club and therefore increases revenue, why wouldn't local companies also depend on foreign players to attract the same revenue you say is important?
I explained in my argument because there's more incentive, you're more accountable to the taxpayers that actually own the club, more decision-making power is actually given to people living and actually being citizens of that town. Therefore, there's more incentive to actually be more accountable or attract people from your own communities. I think that's a natural incentive for you to actually hire people that you come from, right? I think that's a given. In terms of affordability, what is the problem in the status quo? Sports has become so expensive. It's like a brand. You buy expensive merchandises like the lacrosse or like Red Sox. You monetize it because there's no other incentive than to build a brand, an audience, and grow it bigger. There is less incentive, therefore, to focus on how these sports actually provide meaning for the communities and for even the people whose city is like where the stadium actually is located for, and often they're barred from entering because the tickets are just so expensive.
Yeah, yeah.
We think that you're more willing to do that to actually make sports more accessible and like more like cheaper in general, because governments and municipalities, I think, have a natural incentive to do that. You have governments and municipalities having done or like making things like entertainment affordable in the past. We think the same incentive will occur in sports as well. We think it's important that sports is accessible, no thank you, because these stadiums or these local brands of sports, no thank you, have invested in these towns, have taken something from the local communities, right? And we think that it's only fair that the government therefore prioritizes these people in terms of making sports accessible, because that is also what people want. Sports bring people together. Sports names and local teams bring communities together, support together, and they want to see that. And we think it's unfair when you only exclude several people because of money incentive. No, thank you. But it's also better for the players, because what you have now, even though players are probably going to be paid less, you have players from local communities who are probably going to stay longer in these teams and therefore in turn give training or like increase the growth rate of these teams. Why? Because they feel indebted to the kind of tax and to the kind of investment that their own local communities and municipalities have given to them. And therefore, they're also afraid of the backlash of, for example, going to another team that pays them more, right? We think that this turnover is really important when you want to develop teams in like very, very small local communities. And we're not only talking about the big brands. Last problem, we think there is a huge problem of accountability. As you can see with these brands and development of sports, there is a huge problem of scandals of corruption because there is no check and balance, right? Because these private donors can get away probably with the legal consequences and with saying that I won't invest anymore in your clubs. There's also a problem of abuse of players because these players have no other like means to channel their complaints, because it's either you get fired or like you don't play in the sports at all. We think municipalities and local communities are more in check because they're directly accountable and directly voted by the people in those cities. How does this change the incentive? Because people also have a sense of ownership then to call out when there is something happening within these local team sports, within the big brand sports, because they feel like I actually have an ownership in that. My government owns that a club, right? So I think in general, you feel less distant to these clubs because you feel that it's part of you, part of your communities, and it's something meaningful to you, because in general, sports bring pride to these communities and you don't want something naming that name. So we think it's better in general because then you have more incentive to call out such scandals or for such scandals to not happen in the first place because of the kind of backlash that you will have from the people you're indebted to. For all of these reasons, you have more accountability, you have more affordability for sports. We think we bring sports to how it's supposed to be. For all of these reasons, such an open
You know the speech, the House now invites the leader of the opposition.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm prepared to admit that in some cases, perhaps, even the status quo and beyond, there will be clubs who are majority owned by local people and they will do just fine. But to propose it as a universal obligation on all clubs is probably something you do not want to be doing, especially when you are affecting the welfare of thousands of people who are employed by the sports industry in these cities and the fans that are part of the club as well. So I'm going to deal with rebuttal fairly before I move on to two key areas of argumentation. Let's talk about rebuttal. I think Taylor's PY adequately sums up the idea that just because it does not guarantee that local players will take priority in terms of exposure. Even successful clubs like, like Arsenal probably don't suffer as much from foreign ownership as Manchester United or Liverpool. That does not necessarily mean that Arsenal's academy, corresponds to the majority of first-team players on the team. So when the motivation is about the success of the team and about the reputation that you hold relative to all the other teams in the country, probably your ego and your ability to take pride in your team will take precedence over exposure for local players. So we really don't see how this logic stands. Even if it does, however, what opportunities for foreign players from poor countries to access your leagues and play in those leagues and truly make your league a global phenomenon and provide opportunities to such people. I think that's also a consideration I'll be talking about in further detail. More importantly, though, when you talk about issues of accessibility, right? So I'm assuming that they don't foresee a trade-off between accessibility and success. Let's assume that success happens. Success breeds popularity among a global fan base. Therefore, more people visit your country. Therefore, they will go to your stadiums, buy more tickets, and your tickets are going to be more expensive anyway. The implication is that accessibility has no correlation whatsoever to the welfare of the fans in terms of the accessibility of ticket prices. Consequently, we therefore think that their policy does not even solve the problem. It actually leads to further problems down the road. When we are operating on the assumption that you can preserve success as a result of your policy, when it doesn't, you therefore have a very big trade-off between accessibility in terms of being able to watch games for local fans versus A, global representation, not only of players from other countries, but of fans as well, and B, local success, which is integral to many things I'll be talking about in my arguments right now. Let's talk about financing first. I think it's fairly clear that if you do not have local ownership, you will prevent, I suppose, rich businessmen from investing in your clubs in the same way that the sheikhs invest in Manchester City, Abramovich in Chelsea, or even foreign business owners from Singapore who are seeking to buy out second-tier clubs like Villarreal, for example. Yeah, I call them second-tier. You can dispute that. But it's not merely about rich businessmen or rich oligarchs, right? It's also from businesses from elsewhere in the country. You may not belong to Manchester. You may have your headquarters in London, but you want to invest in the Manchester club. Or maybe businesses from overseas who also want to invest in these clubs. And why is that important? Clearly, the most important idea is funding, right? At a point in which professional sport is not cheap, and when you already face insane amounts of competition, not only from clubs within your own country, where they already have access to significant amounts of financing, but also clubs overseas like Real Madrid and Barcelona, you're going to have to keep up. Otherwise, you'll be denied. Otherwise, you'll not be able to compete with them in terms of entry to the Champions League or other lucrative leagues, which are essential for your financing because of the prize money and because of TV sponsorship. Now, the rebuttal that will come out of government is pretty simple, right? They will say, but if you apply this if you apply this policy globally, you won't find as much of an issue. Maybe they will claim that rich investors tend to invest in the richest clubs anyway, perpetuating the inequality. First of all, I would like to point out that inequality still persists even if this policy applies globally, because clubs like Manchester United already have the reach to access millions of fans to buy their merchandise and buy their tickets, which means the inequality persists. More importantly, we argue that sort of inequality that still persists, it's a far more predictable and ossifying form of inequality than investment decisions made by rich businessmen to invest in second-tier clubs, which happens at a greater frequency than you would expect, right? Because it's not always due to existing profitability or existing success of these clubs. It's also about whether they have emotional attachments to these clubs or whether they think there is investment potential or profitability potential in investing in a second-tier club as opposed to investing in a club that's already mature and where the potential increases in profit margins are not as return on investment basically is not going to be as great. So we think the sort of inequality that is created as a result of rich businessmen or businesses investing in clubs is less predictable and on the whole more equal than the sort of inequality which will persist under your policy. But it's also about decision making, right? When local owners can make bad financial decisions as well, with regard to, oh no, maybe we should expand our stadium to include 50,000 seats instead of 30,000. They make a bad financial decision, overestimate their financial capabilities, and they go under as a result. And that is when we need other businessmen from other sources of funding from overseas to step in and ensure that these clubs survive, so that all the benefits we have with regard to local representation, local pride, employment, so on and so forth, accrue to these local clubs as well. The impacts are pretty simple. You've got three. A, financial viability of entire cities. Success brings about immense amount of tourism and ticket sales in terms of employment as well. That is particularly important to small clubs who may have to rely on alternative sources of funding. Otherwise, they will lose out under the current system. B, in terms, I'll take you in a moment, enjoyment of sports and sporting ideals, right? It doesn't affect the quality of sports of a single club. It affects the quality of an entire league if you shut off the entire sources of funding from all of these clubs, as well as the sporting quality as a whole. Yeah.
The very kind of thing you're talking about makes for the fact that there's a huge disparity between Wimbledon and Manchester in terms of income, in terms of social disparity, and so on.
Right. No, I get the point that certain cities and certain clubs already have existing sources of inequality. That is a precise premise of my argument, right? The idea that some forms of inequality persist And we argue that those forms of inequality that persist regardless under your policy are going to be far worse than the sort of inequality that we're supposedly perpetuating under our model. The second argument about representation. The reality and the assumption of their case is that, like clubs belong to local fans. If you are born in Manchester, if you had the fortune to be born in Manchester, and if you are born white, yeah, you have first claim over representation of the club. Bullshit. There are hundreds of thousands, no, millions of fans all across the world who genuinely invest in their clubs by buying merchandise, traveling to the games, spending thousands of dollars, but you're going to exclude them from share ownership and by extension, decision-making power, precisely because they happen to be born in the wrong city or the wrong country. The comparative mechanism on our side is simple. Fan associations get these fans together in order for them to collectively exercise their share ownership rights. This ensures they make decisions with regard to whether you should build a new stadium or other financial decisions or potential takeovers by other rich businessmen. This is important in ensuring global fans are represented in the decision-making capabilities of their clubs, ensuring the health of their clubs and the representation of their fans. For all of those reasons, vote open up.
Yeah.
Thank you for the speech. The House invites the Deputy Prime Minister.
Municipalities having a 51% share in the ownership of their clubs is a good thing for those that they have forgotten to talk about, because they talk about the extremes. They talk about the richest clubs that supposedly have some sort of global ownership, even though those global fans only contributed to screaming when they win on Facebook, but not actually investing in the local infrastructure in most instances, which we don't think is a fair argument. And we believe that in this instance, democratization of sports teams is very good. And it's very good for those communities that depend on sports, not just for success, not just for winning those cups, but as a community activity, something that gathers everyone around, something that gives you pride in your community, particularly if you're from a poor town, particularly if you're from a town that has been devastated by unemployment, or something that gives you the pride and gives you the ability to actually have these ties in the first place. We believe this is a very good thing for them. We believe it makes sports equitable, which I'm going to talk about. We believe it gives you a sense of ownership and belonging over your sports teams, and we believe that those things trump whatever came out from idle speech. But before that, a couple of rebuttals. So he started out by saying, like, look, no, universality is not a good thing. We can't simply demand that from everyone because, like, we never really clearly heard a reason, and we believe it's actually a good thing because you want universality, because you don't want the asymmetry of some teams still clinging onto their institutional memory and their fame and getting almost limitless support from those millions of donors that are coming in to, like, fund Barcelona, whereas others are going to be forgotten. We believe it actually, yeah, it constrains the pie of sports that we have, but it actually makes it way more equitable in a lot of instances because business owners are going to go in somewhere else that they previously hadn't ventured, right? So that's a good thing, and we need this universality in this case. So you say, like, look, local players don't get a chance anyways, and there's no reason why they would get a chance under our model. No. Because when you democratize sports and when the municipality owns the sports teams, therefore they become accountable on the decision making for, like, board decisions or hiring decisions or player acquisition decisions, it actually means that sports players that are local have a better chance of making it to the team and staying on the team because the citizens of that community are more likely to care about those people being represented as opposed to some sort of vague profit or that team being more popular on the global stage in those instances becoming. We believe this is a good thing, and we believe this is something that, especially for players that have been neglected in local poor communities, this gives them a chance to go up the ranks from early childhood and become good players. So this is also a point at which you actually have those players caring a lot more about those local communities and teams because they actually feel indebted for them going through the pipeline and actually ending up in a team, having the ability to represent and do what they love in those instances. We believe that that's a very, very good thing. Now, they have this point about, like, oh, it's actually good that you can attract foreign players and stuff like that. Look, that's the problem, right? These are the teams that do that. These are the teams that actually are the richest ones, that have institutional memories, which is an exclusive resource in the sports field that other teams cannot ever have unless we actually make some adjusting policies in the status quo. So if you want to talk about those things, you also have to talk about communities that are mid-sized, that never had teams that maybe performed and never actually had very good investment in those sports teams in these instances. Sure, Max.
So in the opposition world, there are many recent success that can beat institutional merit, and the recent success is tied to infrastructure and resources. How in your world would you be able to defeat the institutional merit?
So just a clarification, most of those infrastructure, so like building stadiums and building schools and building swimming pools, actually comes from the community itself in the first place. Like, it's not as if those people who are rich donors come in and build those things. What they do is they pay too high salaries for those sports people for no good reason in many instances. What they do is they just build up that brand. But the infrastructure actually belongs to the people 99% of the time. So it's also additionally unfair that other people get to come in and capitalize on the infrastructure that always is built by the local people. In that instance, we believe that this is absolutely inequitable, and this is something that happens on our side anyways. Therefore, it's fine if they get owned majority-wise by those local people. And this last thing about success versus access, and somehow that there's a dichotomy. First of all, we don't necessarily believe that there's a dichotomy between success and access. We think only in a private model where you need to actually always display and have profit margins, always beat out the other teams, where this becomes a dichotomy. When you actually do not have clubs that are as private as now, and that when you have clubs that are more democratic in those instances, you can actually subsidize those prices for local communities and for people that never had the chance to see the good teams or the fun teams or even their own team because it was too expensive. You can do that through the local government way more, and there's way more of an incentive for the local government to do that than for a rich donor who probably comes from overseas, right? And like, even if that's true, even if we diminish like fun of sport, the funness of sport, or the success of some team, we still believe it's better because we remodeled sports into something that is a community thing that gathers communities, binds them together, and gives meaning for those people, which is what I want to move on to now. So let's talk about how this makes sports teams more how this makes sports a more equitable field, and why this sense of belonging and having those teams and owning those teams for the people is a good thing. So like, we introduce a restraint, obviously. Like, there's a constraint because now you have to subsidize it from the budget. Now 51% of the money comes from the local community. Most of the time, we still allow private donors to come in and fund those teams. There's a misconception in adult speech that somehow that wouldn't be happening in the first place, right? But yes, we make the pie smaller. That means that the share and the amount of money that you can invest across teams becomes way more equitable because there is a ceiling to a degree to which you can invest in teams. So that means that in instances that you won't have almost unlimited funding from all of these donors coming in just to Barcelona because they want to be to Barcelona because it's something that's lucrative, attractive, and people love it. Because now you have that 49% restraint. That means that for investors that love sports, and most of those investors are such that they want to own a sports team because they love the process of sports, they're going to be going elsewhere and they're going to be meaningfully investing in other teams. So there's not only a floor to which there's a ceiling to which you can invest, which makes it probably less investment heavy, but more equitable as a field between cities. You also have a lot of these investors going in somewhere else because the space has already been crowded out by other investors in the first place in those big teams, which is very good for small teams. So what does this mean? The impacts are that the sports become more exciting because it becomes much less predictable because not only one team all the time wins because they can gather all the best players, because they can gather all the best equipment and gear. That is very important in this instance because it makes sports fun for everyone, not just Barcelona fans, right? Secondly, it becomes something that you own because it becomes intrinsically much more fun when you feel that you as a actually actively participate into building the reputation of the sports teams, into being part of the sports teams. That's exactly why in Lithuania, most municipalities give loads of money to their city sports teams because people can feel part about it. That's something that they're willing to trade off other things for in these instances because it feel like they own the team, which makes them like it even more. We beg you to propose.
Thank you for the speech. The House invites the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
issue with opening government is that for them, they seem to presume that making local communities own sports means that everything will stay the same, but now instead we only have the check and balance of municipalities. I would argue that in the event in which local communities now own those spots, the drop in funding, because a lot of the times the reason why rich investors don't want to go into this like clubs in the first place is so that they can have ownership over those clubs and use it as some sort of like pride or ego thing in order to like pursue their own ends, for example, is the reason why sports is so big right now and so important, right? But not also that their biggest benefit of the idea of identity and meaning is not mutually exclusive in this debate, because we're only talking about a precise segment of sporting achievements, like for example things like Manchester City, Manchester United, for instance, which are privately owned clubs that yes come from a certain community, but at the end of the day there are still things like national events and World Cup in which these communities are still able to bend around and still able to gain and derive meaning from. So the argument on their doesn't make sense, because it only gains weight in a world in which it is the only avenue by which these individuals are able to derive that meaning and some sense of community from these sporting achievements, but also recognize that many small local communities, for example, still do exist, right? But but precisely because these are small local communities, they end up playing within local leagues instead, and never actually have the ability to break through to the bigger leagues where the money. And the reason for that is the differential rate of funding for these clubs versus those that are big. The second clarification that we want is what Adil told you at the very beginning of his speech, which is to say that oftentimes communities are able to make those decisions on their own. So to the extent to which Manchester, for example, see benefit in opening up the ownership of club to private investors because they believe that the trickle-down investments that come from, for example, hosting games within their own home city is somehow more lucrative and profitable for a municipality than, say, for example, Leicester City, that choose to remain largely locally, for example, but then continue to create the upset of the year when they are able to get into the Premier League, for instance. These are examples of clubs having the autonomy to decide for themselves what they wish to achieve and how they ought to achieve it. So I don't understand why principally on their side, they want to take away the autonomy of these local communities to be able to make those decisions with regards to the biggest benefits that they can have of sports, but as well as for the people on the ground who may not be as invested in sports in those areas. The next, okay, so those two clarifications done, let's talk about what exactly the problem in this debate is. I think the biggest problem with opening government is they simply give lip service to the idea that the pie is now going to be smaller. They're not really explaining to us what exactly that means. So to the extent we recognize that revenue for sports only comes about from for a lot of money. And literally our case on opposition to buy sports with money is precisely important when it comes to giving all the benefits we are talking about. So to the extent we recognize there are large reasons why the thing in the world today is because of billions of dollars of investment that come from individuals or companies that see a huge return. It is not enough to say that if 1% being owned by a local community is good enough. These are companies that want to have a deciding vote when it comes to the management of these teams. That is the reason why all of the incentives they talked about how local communities are more likely to want to take in local players, for example, are the precisely why these investors will not want to enter and continue to donate money to these clubs as well. So they needed to defend why is it that a smaller league is not it's one that somehow still good, recognizing that all of the benefits is the idea that people can gain meaning for it, for example, it's not something, no thank you, that happens in a smaller club, because the counterfactual is not one in which people simply support their local communities, but rather one in which people either change to a different kind of sport that privately owned, for example, having clubs that are not linked to local community, for example, but entirely privately owned clubs. You change the landscape of sport, no thank you, into one that really divorces itself from the idea of having some sort of local community or national identity, and into one that is largely privately owned that still deals with the same things that people want to see, i.e. good players fighting it out among each other, but has no benefits to the communities at hand. The second thing that we wanted to talk about was this idea of standards of sporting achievement. So many people about sports. Presumably people care about sports because they see some sort of pushing of human boundaries and they enjoy the game as a whole. So thank you, Simras. But the point of matter is that this doesn't happen in a world in which you don't have the kind of money that's being invested in the game right now. So to the extent to which we recognize that we require continual investment for rich individuals, it's not enough for you to simply say institutional memory and the investment from lots of people. So you want to talk about inequitability. I don't really see how exactly their side is going to solve the problem of Manchester United, for example, or Arsenal already having a large fan base and therefore having inequitable amounts of resources in order to be able to fund their players. But more importantly, recognizing as well that communities have huge disparities in terms of the amount of money they have and the amount of money they're able to invest into those sports, which only increases that disparity. Yeah.
So you literally give us an example of Leicester that is probably majority owned by the local community, but still gets investment, because that's going to be the new lens. That's how you can actually have that honor and pride, because you can fund like 40% of the team, and that will be fine because they love doing that in those instances.
No, what I'm saying is Leicester City is the exception because we remain majority owned, and that's why people didn't expect to be able to win. Those are options that clubs can continue to go into if they believe that those kinds of investments they do themselves are able to make those clubs reach their sporting achievement. But the important difference is that at the end of the day, given that investors want to be able to make decisions to ensure that their club wins, they are unlikely to invest in places like Leicester City, which is the reason why in the next cycle of games, for example, Leicester City's performance was fairly inconsistent, precisely because locally. So to the extent to which we recognize sporting achievement is something that's important to people, we want to maintain standards of those games. We need to recognize that a huge amount of investment in it is something that's important, but also recognizing that it still gives huge amounts of benefit to people within those local communities when you have home games, for example, and also when you're able to still see sort of affiliated with those clubs at the end of the day. Second argument about this idea of identity and right? So I think that you can still have pride in your team regardless of whether or not you actually own shares from that team, just via the idea that, for example, you recognize the value of that specific team, you still feel some sort of affiliation to the team as a whole. To the extent to which you don't, you simply shift your allegiance to other things. And to the extent to which, for example, there is a global fan base over these kinds of clubs, I don't understand why that's somehow a lesser identity than that of a municipality. So the idea, for example, that fairness is something that's incredibly important in this instance doesn't actually make sense if you recognize that the fairness comes about with a lesser standard of these kinds of sporting achievements. And the reason why people tune in the first place to see the kind of high-level game that's going, we think that still exists. We have to oppose.
Okay.
That's the government again.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, there are going to be 3 points in extension in this speech. First of all, I want to tell you why sports are absolutely for the local communities, and the ability to attend those sports on the weekends and benefit from that experience is incredibly important. I think OT mentioned that. I'm going to give you what actually happens in those scenarios. Secondly, I want to look at how their policy actually destroys local sports in other countries. So in places such as India, in places such as Bangladesh, where Manchester United is able to get all of the fan base, destroys the local football teams in those communities. Finally, we want to look at competition and extend what it from. Okay. So first of all, on this idea of why these sports are absolutely important. So opening government told that it is good because it gives it's entertainment, it's fun, right? I want to tell you exactly what happens in these scenarios. The vast majority of the people who attend these local sports are people who are working class people who work in blue collar jobs, Speaker, who work in jobs of drudgery. Your plumbers, your carpenters, your clerks, Mr. Speaker. Their lives are hard, right? They're constantly pushed around by the employers 6 days a week, and they work huge number of hours minimum wage, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely important for these people who are abused and really have shitty lives, don't have a lot of income, to be able to gain the only source of happiness, to be able to attend a club on the weekends and cheer for the teams that they all support.
right? To have 10,000 people around you who are constantly cheering at the point where your like local player scores a goal, Mr. Speaker. That experience is the only source of happiness and the only source of escape and catharsis from the drudgery that currently surrounds the lives of these people, Mr. Speaker. That's why it's absolutely important to prioritize the local people in these scenarios, right? Even if you get access internationally on that side, we think the importance of sport is what is most directly and most impactful on the local communities. That's why it's most important. Secondly, how does that policy destroy local sports in other places, right? So first of all, I want to look at local sports and why is it important for have a local football team? Why is it important for to have local football team or local basketball team, right? We think football, for the very reason that I described, right? These benefits should not only be felt in Sunderland or in Manchester. It's important for Dhaka to have a football team that the entire community can rally around. I will tell you later why that does not happen. Secondly, we think one of the importance of sports is like encouraging sports among the youth to get more and more people involved in that. Is like one of the reasons why governments currently incentivize that. We think thirdly, it is important for like the Lucknow sports team to engage with other communities, etc. It like opens up an opportunity for them to interact with other teams. Finally, we think it's important for these countries to have important like good teams, right? It's been like 50 years and India has never qualified for a World Cup. I think aside just produce that inequality at the point where you don't allow local football teams to ever like produce the kinds of players who rise up to that level. Why does their policy kill local teams? First of all, right, we think the idea of following football at the point that Manchester United, Barcelona is able to advertise itself in these countries becomes like sitting in a bar, sitting with your friends and watching Manchester United in the team. It detracts from the idea of like going to the club and actually supporting your team that's playing on the sports in those cases. But secondly, right, your expectations become incredibly high, Mr. Speaker, right? If you're like watching Manchester United and Real Madrid, and then you see your Bangladeshi like sports team, which you don't see playing the same quality of football, you're unlikely to want to support that. You're unlikely to see that that is anything valuable, Mr. Speaker, right? So if the argument is that this decreases the access internationally, that's a thing, because we think that people actually start to respect the local teams more and more. We think finally, and this is incredibly important, currently, at the point where Indian investors and like Bangladeshi want to invest, or like Qatar investors, right, want to invest in like in sports, want to invest in like sports already successful in like those countries, right? Because there's a limit. They are going to sit down. They are going to spend on local football teams to develop the local sports in their particular communities. Mr. Speaker, I told you why local sports are incredibly important. That's why it kills the success. I want to take over.
So, if they don't invest in these clubs you want them to invest in, what makes you so sure they'll invest these funds in other sports or in other clubs when they have lucrative opportunities elsewhere, or when they don't have loyalty to these other clubs?
No, because like there's profit made if you invest in sports, and like some opportunities to invest in like the more profitable sports is cut off. That means it's more likely on our side that you invest in the other sports, right? In the long term, they're going to become more and more profitable, Mr. Speaker, right? We think it's not the case that no one like spends money in hockey, for example, in India, and that's why hockey is very popular in India. But the only reason it is because there's not an international league that's competing with hockey in the same way there is one for football, in the same way there is one for basketball. So local investors start to invest at the point where this happens. Finally, want to look at competition, right? Mr. Speaker, and the status quo. Oh, okay, opening government told you that like most people like care about the game and therefore they spend like, invest in particular sports. So we think the actual reasons why businessmen choose particular teams are different. First of all, they want to go to a already popular team because there's already a popular they didn't have into, right? They're probably more there. They want to choose Manchester United and Real Madrid over your Brighton and your Sunderland. Secondly, we think there's already like more popularity in those kinds of cases, Mr. Speaker, right? We know that rich clubs do not invest in Brighton and Sunderland because that's literally the status quo, despite what the opening opposition suggested, right? Opening opposition said that there's a disincentive to like continue investing in United because like the returns get dried up, but like empirically that's false because we see that like they just keep getting funds. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, there's a practical reason why that's false. Because Manchester United can like for the like mid-term future, we can just continue expanding its reach globally, right? Just continue expanding Africa and India, and the returns are not going to get dried up. The returns are just going to keep flowing in, right? Equalize that playing ground, Mr. Speaker, because we minimize it down now. Minimize the impact of these foreign, these rich investors on this, right? Because there's only like 40% now, like 9% now that you can invest. the rest is like competed by like the local communities, right? And the opening wanted to say the local communities are gonna like perpetuate the same problems of inequality. First of all, Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely not clear why the local community in Manchester is so much richer than the local community in Sunderland, right? We think that's absolutely like no reason was given to substantiate that claim, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, we would say that actually those problems are like comparatively lesser than the problem of investors, all of them flowing to one particular community over and over again, Mr. Speaker. Okay, I want to look at some points of rebuttal now, right? They said that, so they said that, okay, there's going to be substantially lesser funding on our side because like this is just not going to come in. We actually don't think that's the case. It's going to be funding and like reasonable amounts of funding. Here's why. Because in the event that like investors realize these clubs are also succeeding, they're going to continue to invest. We think they are going to succeed because locals will make good decisions with regards to these clubs, right? It's not the case that when you hire local talent, like you're not going to be successful. Arsenal became a successful club based on the local talent that wanted to develop. Often investing lots and lots of money on people such as Mera, $200 million is actually a wasteful investment, right? In the event, Mr. Speaker, that on our sides, these clubs become successful, ultimately, investors are going to start coming in. So it's also not the case that there's going to be no money aside. For those reasons, very proud.
Yo, I'm in the house.
Thank you for the speech. That was a remember.
Okay, Amrit.
Unfortunately for all three houses in the state, it's not a simple dichotomy between local ownership versus private. The debate is about the requirement that it must be locally owned at any cost. Because it's true that there are rich municipalities that compete with foreign clubs and they can beat the prices, they're equally profitable, and they will naturally have ownership over them. This debate is about instances where the local municipalities would have lost, but you are still giving the ownership of their club to that municipality, and why we think it's harmful. What's important in this debate and why is closing going to enter this debate? Two things. First, we are going to contest that local incentives that are more profit are a better incentive in running clubs, and we think they generally have worse talent development, worse infrastructure development, worse merit assessment systems. Second, we will prove that we have international development as well as local development. Because I think the assumption is that local individuals deserve it more is just highly false, because local clubs and local individuals are arbitrary. But we think individuals suffer across the world, in Cameroon, in West Indies, where they're just literally arbitrarily poorer, and we say we have an equal right to their development, and therefore we must prioritize them. Everything that is said in this house will be integrated by matter. Have a seat, I'm coming to you. First, are local teams better off local ownership? The premise of the argumentation in the opening of government was that we will get private money anyway. According to the opening opposition, we think this is true. We need a deciding vote within the club. The reason why this is true, however, we will provide because of two things. First, you are literally making all the risky options on where you are placing your money in. So if foreign investors don't get to decide who they are pumping money into, where they're investing in infrastructure, they are literally making this on their back for someone else's logic in sports. But the second thing is they don't get the capacity to put their merchandising on products. Like Aeon won't be able to purchase Manchester United, won't be called the Emirates Stadium. You don't get a deciding vote on where profit goes. These two things prove that there is definitely less money in the opening government. Why are local individuals worse? If you listen to the characterization of the opening government, taxpayers' money is the reason why they are accountable to the people. Well, what does taxpayer incentive look like? This means they're not going to prioritize investment. They'll probably have incentive to buy to local elections. This is what most important. So they invest in a majority area group. Probably they wouldn't care about whether to invest in poorer communities like in Barcelona, in the Barcelona, who get investment because it's not profitable. But local investors who see merit for the merit that there is would enter this area. And Neymar was literally taken out of Brazilian favela, even though he's poorer, less capable, because it was literally the incentive of the merit-based reward system that prioritize profit over a local election-based system according to the local law. So they can't say that they get a better investment of poorer people or whatever the hell they decided. But the second thing they say, inequality. Look, we are going to be the first to suggest inequality is worse off in their world. Because look, those municipalities and poorer municipalities can provide on themselves. It is just like Queens, the area in UK, it's really poor. They can only rely on themselves. That's the status quo where investors here don't intend to enter because they don't get the name. They're not going to have multiple you know, it's all supposed to be access from your friends or people who is the one of the just essentially local clubs outside compared to market rules and intended to be affordable for individuals. I think all these things that local companies are local communities are far worse towards this investment than other entities. Second, development. Look, I want to talk about things here. The first thing I'm going to suggest is that the close composition doesn't actually explain why we were having better local development methods. I want to explain why this is one. First, we think rich investors are the only ones who will enter areas for the enterprises like Cameroon, West Indies, parts of Dhaka and India to excavate talent and create local infrastructure that is profitable. The only reason they do this is because they're the only ones with a comfortable profit margin with the capacity to use the money to expand this. That's why Manchester United has the highest development fund in the world. They go into like Brazil, they go into areas in parts of Malaysia, and the reason they do is because they want to be the first one to discover new talent. The fact that we're able to discover Neymar and we're able to discover like Sankakkara from Sri Lanka, a cricketer, were only because they were able to go into communities that were untapped as a result of this. This means first, we get local development in communities that are just significantly poor, third world countries, with the closing one to talk about. Second, we have a development of local Indian cricket scene. This is what I'm going to do with the closing opposition. In a world where the cricket scene could only rely on itself, then cricket scene is likely to collapse. No one is going to buy into the cricket scene because it's lesser quality. And look, if you are a cricket player and you knew this was the glass ceiling, I can only earn this much money, you wouldn't enter into the club. You go into other avenues, your Indian parent will force you to join architecture. There's so many barriers that exist. If you don't tell them you can one day become like Neymar, that cricket scene will die out. So I think the closing opposition suggesting that the Indian cricket scene can somehow be better if we let it go on by itself is highly false. So we get that. But a second, this is important. We have actually an incentive to pump money to niche sports. In places like Malaysia or in communities that are poorer, there's a high deprioritization of rugby and cricket for already existing popular sports. So people currently suffer because there's no access to it. Investors have an incentive because they want to increase and split the market. They want a monopoly over that control, therefore we can niche sports. But before that, yes.
Poor communities or communities that don't have very popular sports teams still have those sports teams, but they don't have the investment to back it up. So why do we not equalize the field if we actually have this ownership? And Barcelona also has to limit the amount of private ownership or private investment that is injected.
In a world where money cannot change the demographics, people rely on institutional memory only. You don't have a combating power, therefore you accrue all the harms, except there's no counterbalance. We can't have people finding QPR to fight Manchester United's power because there's no capacity to fight that. But the last extension that we think is important is we get development of individuals that don't have access to it. Like niche clubs within Malaysia, for example, rugby, would never get funded by local municipalities because there's no incentive. It often costs a high amount of money, but it was only developed by international investors because they knew that they had the capacity to monopolize that market. That means in the closing opposition, we get development not of just existing players in local communities that previously would not have gotten the development, but second, we also develop in national, like sporting leagues that exist. The Indian Cricket League is only a thing within the status quo because it has the capacity to become greater than it currently is. The fact that I can possibly join a international football team, or the fact that I can possibly earn millions and millions of dollars, is the only incentive that brings people to stadiums. Pride and catharsis can exist in a world where people feel proud of good quality players and have an incentive to become greater. In a world where the quality is shittier and people don't have a prerogative to enter clubs, there will be no pride, there will only be shame.
Yeah. Shame, sorry.
Thank you for the speech. The House invites the government with care.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk softly. That doesn't mean that I believe less in my case. Two things in this speech. Firstly, competition and fairness, according to what Sharik said in our extensions. Secondly, international appeal and why we think it makes things worse on the international ground. But before that, let me deal with this weird thing coming from closing opposition. Their inability to decouple sponsorship and ownership is, I think, what lost in the debate. Because Bet365 will still sponsor teams and provide them money in order to have brands on the t-shirt and brands in the merchandise, but do not own managerial decisions within the decisions of the sports team. We think that presumably board members of the local community being on the board, taking decisions as directors of that particular institution, can still make the decision to have Rakuten as the major sponsor and as their shirt sponsor within those institutions. We think the Emirates Sports Ground will still exist. We think Villarreal will still have its stadium known as the Vicente Calderon and so on and so forth. And secondly, on this Neymar thing and how he was picked out of Favela, right? I think Neymar was bought for $190 million from Santos when he was in Brazil. We think he already was a big player within Brazil. We think he was already good enough to represent best of the best clubs within Brazil and outside. We think at the point of time where Neymar could have stayed back in Brazil and inculcated local talent to proceed and follow within the institutions, we think Brazil would have done much better in the World Cup in 2014 and in the Confederations Cup later on. We think the ability of local talent to persuade individuals within local communities to follow their dreams and be like them and represent national institutions is far better under our side. Lastly, let's talk about let's talk about Malaysia and AirAsia and QPR. Right? They tell us, oh, QPR went up. I think when Tony Fernandes from AirAsia bought QPR back in 2012, they were already in the first division. Guess where they're playing now? They're Division 4 right now, Mr. Speaker, and they've been relegated multiple times due to bad financial decisions and not being financially sustainable with regards to local community and investing. Sit down. And this last thing on the Indian cricket scene, right? Like, I'm going to tell you a few things which you already know coming from the subcontinent. The Ranji Trophy exists. Already people in local communities. Those teams are owned by DCAs and municipalities or like local cricketing bodies or state institutions that already own them. We think India was doing equally well before the IPL as they did after the IPL. We think there was no change that IPL brought, but rather made it worse given that more and more institutions went into things like the T20, things like one-day internationals and so on and so forth, rather concentrating on making the cricketing abilities like akin to the best of the best before that. We think the generation of Sachin Tendulkar, VVS Lakshman, Rahul Dravid, before IPL, were much better in carrying forward the traditions and making us think of them as idols than the people we have now in terms of Bhuvneshwar Kumar or Jasprit Bumrah. Let's talk about competition and fairness, right? We think the primary reason as to why there's a disparity in sports league today is the disparity of competition within those sports league itself, right? OG went to the extent of telling you that we'll impose a financial restraint and investors will now like invest in different areas. We think it goes far beyond that from CGI. We told you multiple things. We told you investors invest in primarily bigger teams that exist or like have residents in bigger cities that already have infrastructure. So it's more likely that they'll invest in Chelsea, Tottenham, Arsenal that exist in bigger cities such as London or in Manchester United. Manchester United exists in bigger cities such as Manchester because they have larger infrastructure, larger ability to appeal to local population, and larger ability to appeal to the international world. We think this takes away the ability of investors, ability of the financial, or like the financial backing that comes with international investors from things such as Sunderland, from things such as Wimbledon, from things such as West Bromwich Albion, and so on and so forth. We think at that point of time, this opens, on our side, it opens the leagues to a more open field. We think, why is that? Because we think the majority of population in London and Sunderland is not that disparate with regards to their income levels, with regards to their way to support their institution, with regards to putting that money up to support their local club, as might be the disparity between a local community and local municipality versus say an international investor coming in. We think that most of the workers within those institutions, as Sharik told you, are blue-collar workers who work in regular day jobs and so on and so forth. I think there's not much difference between London and Sunderland. We think at that point of time, it takes down others' comparative that the inequality is far worse on our side, because we think that on their side, institutions such as these, which are owned by local communities, sit down, please. Institutions such as these, which are owned by local communities, have a lot more disparity as compared to institutions such as those owned by international investors. And we think it permeates to the socio-economic strata within those cities, right? We think that big cities versus small cities and the socio-economic disparity that comes with it, for example, say London, Manchester versus smaller cities, grows with that because at the point of time, bigger investors are able to invest in infrastructure development of stadiums, roads around that stadiums, access roads, so on and so forth, subways and so on and so forth, so as to appeal to the public in order to gain more money on more and more people coming into that particular institutions and more tourists coming in to watch, say, Manchester United play rather than see Derby County play. We think at that point of time, we sit down. At that point of time, we think that it makes things worse on the socio-economic front. We think infrastructure developments such as Barcelona and Catalonia, etc., are far more pervasive under the opposition. We think that people dependent on the sports industry, as Adil mentioned, are also now more disparate with regards to people within those big clubs in bigger cities, right? Because at the point of time when more investors are able to afford more jobs and so on and so forth, we think the income disparity increases within those institutions. We think on our side, where leagues in the Western world are more popular, we think that makes it under their side, where the leagues in the Western world are more popular. I think even between countries of like different economic institutions, different socio-economic strata, such as leagues, such as the I League or Football League in India versus EPL. versus the EPL in England, we think the countries become more socio-economically disparate. We said, I didn't understand why others said inequality is better on their side. Yeah, open.
Yeah. So to the extent to which we already told you why these investors at a point where they've been deciding for have an incentive for larger retail investment to invest in smaller clubs. Why then is there some sort of incentive now for them to invest in clubs they've never been interested in before?
Sharik has already told you as to why investors don't have an incentive to smaller clubs. Why is that? Because Manchester United already has more space to grow and offer more return on investment as compared to smaller clubs that have pre-existing institutional bias with regards to international appeal and local appeal. We think it's far more pervasive under their side. We told you on our side we exist financial accountability. There's lack of coffers and buffers for these people to keep pumping in money, as I told you with regards to the Neymar transfer and everything. We think it's far more financially sustainable. Lastly, on international appeal, right? We think the TV broadcast deals, La Liga, Serie A, etc., are still done by leagues instead of clubs. So we think the international appeal does not die out, but tapers down to the extent where it's more of a balanced field between local institutions, local leagues versus international leagues, right? They already mentioned that Manchester United already has support. We think removing the ability to travel in the summer for these institutions, for these clubs, etc., or offer merchandise to international institutions, we think is far better. Removing Air Asia's ability to wholly invest in QPR does two things. Either they invest 40% in QPR or invest 40% in another Malaysian club. We think their ability to use that money both ways now instead of 100% in just QPR makes it far better on both fronts. We think that's all those reasons give the debate.
Hey, please. People be referencing you for how many months. Keep giving me this chance once. Sorry, Max. I was like, oh, we're done. I'm like, oh, fuck, no, we're done.
This is an issue very close to my heart, so don't expect me to be as patient and as ignorant as closing government. Because unfortunately, the debate needs to move past name dropping and convenient examples. Because Neymar transfer was 200 million, yes, but he was a successful product of years of privatization. He was successful products of warriors of the favela who chose to use football as a mechanism to escape their structural poverty. And as a result of that incentive is the reason why people like Neymar will emerge in those markets. Let me deal in this debate in two parts. First, let me deal with closing closing government, and then we'll deal with opening government. Let's deal with the less irrelevant one. Oh, the irrelevant one first, closing. So closing first say, you get some happiness, yes, but that happiness is not unique to, like, an individual from Malaysia can still derive any form of happiness by watching Manchester United when playing, because I feel I identify with the struggles of the club. But here's the reason why. I think sports are complex and there are many different types of sports. As in Malaysian, I watch badminton and I support badminton, a sport that Malaysians are good at, and I don't watch football because Malaysians suck at it, right? And there's a reason why. As a Bangladeshi, therefore I watch cricket in Bangladesh, but I won't watch football. And there's a reason for that. And I will tell you why that even in that circumstance we make things better. But not at this point, the entire government bench just would like to prioritize viewers. And at this point, I think closing opposition was the first one to tell you that sports isn't just about viewer satisfaction. There are many other things that are more important. Factually, I think the cricket Indian leagues are not owned by our local municipality. Last time I checked, the Ambani had a huge stake in the ownership of this club. Even Shah Rukh Khan owns a couple of clubs. So therefore, I think a large part of reason of success is the ability of private ownership. And Amrit from CEO is the only one that tells you that the reason of why they are able to do that is because there's enough investment. Because while OG tells you that investment is enough for you to enter competitive area, they never tell you what these advantages are. Only in CEO you get that more money means that they're more incentivized to find talent, because the first mover advantage means they're able to benefit from it. And secondly, they're able to build better infrastructure. This directly deals with a lot of material that came up from OG that says that infrastructure of stadium is done by local municipality. It is called an Alliance Arena, Emirates Stadium, and O2 Stadium for a reason, because these are done by private companies. These are initiatives that is made by a lot of big companies that won't be made by local municipalities, and I'll make the comparison later. But the second thing they also that's closing government suggests that people invest in Manchester, people won't invest in Sunderland. This is just blatantly untrue. I won't give you an example, but let's derive the logic here. Why would not a company support Sunderland, who's getting when they're getting premium airtime in the most watched league
in the entire world.
Yeah.
This is a very good incentive for a lot of our companies to also enter. And we told you that this is why companies will enter and will benefit and will improve the situation on the ground. Therefore, the closing government or extension or local municipality will build better infrastructure is also flawed. Not only for the reasons I gave you, but the extension material that came out from Amrit goes on to tell you that the incentive for local municipality is vastly different. As elaborated by OG, these guys are not merit-based. These guys will do something to just satisfy their the individuals on the ground. What makes you think that private companies would enter? This nicely brings on to the extension material that came out from Amrit that argues that local municipalities have very bad incentive.
Yeah.
Why would private incentive company would enter if they're not able to decide what players they're going to get in, what are the technical decisions they're able to make, and secondly, they are so susceptible to election cycle. Like in Malaysia, like if the government changed from opposition to the ruling party, and these kind of decision making would influence investment, they would not enter. So in your world, there will be less money. But before I move on, I'll take close.
Locals also want their clubs to succeed, and because they are heavily involved in the game, they have some level of expertise as well. Why do you think they're going to make all these bad decisions?
Yeah. I think local companies do want, local supporters do want to do this, but they can't. There's a limitation of how much money you're able to get.
Yeah.
There's a limitation of how much municipality to do. And I don't think you guys are able to bridge the gap. Like, I don't think, like what Amrit says is that while in India, what's going to happen is that local municipalities just going to pump in all the money to cricket, but all the other niche sports would not get any development. But for a private company who knows the profit and the incentive would do this. What are these niche sports that we're talking about? We're talking about rugby leagues in Asia. We're talking about the emergence of the Asian basketball league to incentivize talent. We get so much more talent in that one because there's a profit margin, because there's not only to get people to watch it, but the media, the airtime, the amount of sponsors that you can get in would be good. Let's move on to the opening half of this debate. Is monetization a harm? I don't think so, because monetization is the real incentive why people enter the game. And then the next thing they say is that are local government more accountable than private owners? We don't think so, especially when they pander to election election incentives. They're more susceptible to just catering to people's need rather than catering to fulfilling the merits need, right? And we told you that pride and happiness is a peripheral benefit, ladies and gentlemen, because pride and benefit very often, and people be reasonable, pride and happiness relies on the